In this chapter, we're going to take a look at adding some simple JavaScript to our theme. If we take a look at the design comps provided to us, we notice that there's some JavaScript included with it. Inside of this JS folder, there's a javascript.js file, the jQuery library, and this autofill jQuery plugin. And if I open the index.html file, we can see what that's doing on the page. Up here in our search box, that javascript.js in conjunction with the autofill plugin is adding the text search ... to our search box whenever the search box is empty. As soon as I click on it, the text disappears and I can add whatever search terms I want into the search box. If I deselect the search box, what I entered stays there, unless when I remove focus from the search box, it's empty, it replaces it with that search ... text again. So that's what that JavaScript is doing, and I want that to work inside of our Drupal theme. In order to do that, I'm going to tell Drupal how to include those JavaScript files on the page and make sure that they work with our theme. The first thing that I need to do is actually get those JavaScript files and put them into our theme. I don't need to include the jQuery library here. Drupal has jQuery bundled in with Drupal core, so we don't need the library. We can just assume that it's going to be present when we need it. So I'll copy those files, and over in my 960 robots theme, I'm going to create a new directory, and I'm just going to call it JS, short for JavaScript, and put those two files inside of it. This just allows me to keep things organized with inside of my theme. Awesome. The next thing I need to do is use my .info file to tell Drupal about those two JavaScript files. I'm going to open the .info file up. Earlier in the series, when we discussed .info files, we talked about the fact that you can add JavaScript files through a .info file. So I'm going to do that right here. I'll start a new comment, just so I know what I'm doing here. And then I'm going to use the special syntax for adding JavaScript files. I'm going to use the word scripts, followed by an empty set of square brackets, equals to the path to my JavaScript file relative to my theme. So in this case, that's going to be js/javascript.js. I also want to make sure that I'm including that jQuery autofill plugin on the page. So I'm going to say js/jQuery.autofill.js. So these file names here correspond to the files that I just copied into the JS directory inside of the 960 robots theme. If I go back to my site, I've made changes to my .info file, which means I need to flush the cache so that those changes are picked up and it includes those JavaScript files the next time we reload a page. So I can go to the Performance tab, clear all caches, and then close the overlay. And now, when I view source on my page, if I scroll down and look at all the JavaScript that's included on the page, I can see that the last two items that included are my jQuery.autofill.js file and my javascript.js file from the 960 robots theme. So just by adding them to that info file, we get them to show up here in our page source. So we know those files are being included. However, it looks like that file is not actually doing anything at the moment. I expected it to add the search text here into our text field. There's a couple of reasons that it's not working. First, we want to confirm that the jQuery autofill plugin is being loaded before our javascript.js file. If we look at the source code again, we can confirm that. Yes, it is indeed being loaded first. These files are actually loaded in the order that we declared them inside of our .info file. So in our .info file, we said jQuery.autofill first, and then javascript.js, so I know that it'll include those files in that order. The other thing that I can look at and wonder about is the fact that this search box is actually not working at all. I can type some text into it, click search, nothing happens. It just goes right back to the same page. That's because this is actually still hard-coded into our page template file. So we need to deal with that. We need to do a couple things in order to add Drupal's actual functioning search block. The first thing we need to do is go to the structure page, and then blocks, and then take the Drupal search form, here, the search form, and add it to the header region on our site. Once it's in the header region, I'll click Save. So now I'm showing that actual functioning search form is inside of Drupal's header region. And close that. And I need to do one last thing. I actually need to print out that header region as well, because right now it's still just hard-coded HTML. So if I go back to my page template file and open that up, I can find the portion of the page, this block search form right here, that needs to be replaced with our dynamic header. I'll go ahead and select it. I'll delete it, and then I can just print out that region. Again, printing out regions, all we have to do is open a new PHP block, say print, render, page, and then the machine readable name of our region, which I know is header because that's what I set inside of our .info file. So print, render, and then the header region. Now when I go back to our site and click refresh, I should see that my search form at least functions. I can click search and actually submit the form and perform a search. Great, so that's working now, but it's still not actually highlighting it and putting our search ... text into the field. In order to figure out what's going on here, I'm going to use Safari's console to see if there's any JavaScript errors. So I'm just going to go to develop, show the error console. And yeah, sure enough, there's an error up here. Type error undefined is not a function evaluating yada 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 inside of javascript.js. So I know there's some kind of problem inside of our javascript.js file. $ document, this function is undefined. So let's take a look at that file. If I open up our javascript.js file, right up here in the first line, it's calling this $ function with an argument of document. This is a pretty common construct when you're using jQuery to say, don't perform the code inside of this ready statement until the page has actually been loaded, until the DOM is ready and you can execute JavaScript on it. The important thing to note here in Drupal's case is that this $ function is what's giving us the undefined error. That's because in Drupal 7, jQuery is run in no conflict mode. That means it's not instantiating the $ as the jQuery object. Drupal does this so that it can be compatible with other libraries that may want to use the $ as a symbol for their object as well. It's a common thing. Libraries like Prototype do the same thing. In order to address this problem, there are two things that we could do. We could either change our JavaScript. Instead of using the $ function, we could just type the full name of the jQuery function here and use that. Or we could tell our JavaScript how to use the $ function as the jQuery object. So that's what we're going to do. It's the more common method of doing it in Drupal 7. In order to do that, we can start a new anonymous function in JavaScript. So we do so by opening brackets, function, $, like so. So I've now created a new function, a new JavaScript function that has no name. This is considered an anonymous function. That function is taking one argument. The argument here is the $. At the very end of that function, here, before I add any code inside of it, right at the end, I'm going to close that. So I've now got my anonymous function inside of this javascript.js file. And then I'm going to call that function immediately after declaring it. So just by opening this new set of parentheses here, I'm calling a function that has no name. And I'm passing it an argument of jQuery. So I'm calling an anonymous function, passing in the jQuery object. That function is this one that we defined up here. The variable or argument for this function is the $. So inside of the scope of this function, I can now use the $ to represent the jQuery object. So I could then do something like this, where I just copy and paste my already existing JavaScript inside of that, and it should work. If I flip back over to the site and click refresh, you'll notice that it's actually still not working. I'm going to use the error console once more to see what's going on. I'll say show error console. Looks like I've got a simple syntax error inside of my javascript.js, so I'll flip over and see what that is. And I can quickly see, oops, looks like I have an extra closing parenthesis there. So I'll delete that, save the file, go back to our site, and now when I refresh, even though it's still not working, I'm not getting any errors from our javascript.js file on the page anymore. Okay, so now what's going on? My suspicion is that our jQuery selector here, which is targeting this input element of the type text in an ID inside of an element with an ID of search for the autofill, I'm guessing that this is probably wrong. Drupal doesn't actually have an element with an ID of search. So we need to figure out what ID Drupal is using for that search form. I can do so by switching back over to the site, saying inspect on that element, and inspecting the HTML source. It looks like the form element here, instead of having an ID of search like it did in our original index.html file, it has an ID of search-block-form. So I just need to change my selector in my JavaScript file in order for that to work. Back over to the file. I'll just change this to search-block-form, save, and then switch back. Click refresh on our site. And there it is. It looks like it's working now. It's showing the search ... If I select it, it disappears. And if I unselect it, it shows up again. Awesome. There's one additional thing that we should do whenever writing JavaScript for Drupal. Back in our javascript.js file, we're using this document.ready construct. It's part of jQuery. It allows us to say, don't execute this JavaScript until the DOM is fully loaded and ready to accept this JavaScript. Drupal has a different way of handling this same thing. It's called Drupal.behaviors. Rather than executing our JavaScript only once when the DOM is first loaded and fully ready, Drupal wants us to be able to execute this JavaScript anytime the DOM is loaded or changes are made to the DOM. This is important when something like an AJAX request happens and new elements may be added to the page. We want to ensure that our JavaScript gets run a second time on that DOM so that we have the opportunity to affect any new elements on the page. That's where the Drupal.behavior system comes into play. In order to use that, we need to modify our code just a little bit. So I'm going to start adding in some new code right below what already exists. We're going to use Drupal.behaviors, and then we'll copy and paste the relevant portions of this code into our new section here. Using the Drupal.behavior system looks something like this. Drupal.js, when it's loaded on the page, instantiates this JavaScript object named Drupal. That has a method of behaviors, and then we can add additional methods to that behaviors method for each JavaScript thing that we would like to do on the page. In our case, I'm going to add a new method called 960robots. Drupal will do a couple of things for us automatically. Drupal performs this check on document ready, and when it sees that the document is ready, it loops through all of the methods on this behaviors object and calls each one of them. So our 960robots function here will automatically be called whenever the document's ready. It'll also do that same thing of calling all of the methods attached to this behavior object anytime an AJAX request happens. So my JavaScript will get executed a second time if there's any AJAX that adds new elements to the page, so I can affect those new elements. The 960robots object that we've attached here to Drupal.behaviors and gets called for us automatically by Drupal has two methods that Drupal will call. One of them is attach and one of them is detach. Attach is called whenever this JavaScript is attached to the page, new content is attached to the page, and we need to try to run our JavaScript on things that are being added to the page. Detach is called whenever we need to detach the JavaScript from the page. In our case, we only are concerned with the attach, so we're just going to create an attach method on our 960robots object. And that's going to be this function. The function takes one argument, context. In this case, context is whatever this JavaScript is being called on. So in the case where we've had an AJAX call that added new HTML to the DOM, the only things that are going to be passed to our attach method here are those new elements that were added to the DOM. We're not actually getting the entire DOM a second time. So when we use jQuery to search for things, we'll want to make sure that we use this context variable and only search the relevant portion of the DOM. It just helps improve the speed of things. So we've got this attach method on our 960robots object, which automatically gets called because it's part of the Drupal.behaviors object. All I need to do now is take this code that we had before and move it inside of this attach function. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. I can now delete the code that we had previously save my file. I want to make one more change here. When I have this jQuery selector where I'm trying to select the input text field in our search form, I'm going to pass a second argument to the jQuery function here of context. This is that context that's coming into our attach function. And what this is going to do is make sure that when this code is executed, what we're searching within is only the new elements that are added to the DOM, or the DOM as it was loaded when the page was first loaded. Again, just improving the speed of our JavaScript. I can save that. So this all looks right. And I go back over to our site and click refresh. I don't actually expect it to look any different now. Everything functions the same as it did before. When I click in the field, the word search goes away. When I click out, it comes back. However, we're now following Drupal's best practices of using the Drupal.behaviors method for attaching JavaScript to the page. And we're also casting the jQuery object to the $sign here so that we can just use $sign when selecting elements on the page, as people often do when using the jQuery library. The last part to remember then is that in order to get these JavaScript scripts to show up on the page, we just had to add them to our .info file, which we did. We edited the .info file and added these two additional lines. Scripts, and we added the jQuery.autofill plugin, and then an additional scripts here, and we added our javascript.js file. And that got it to load our JavaScript on the page.